This is Colonel Achterberg of the Earth Defense Fleet. Withdraw your remaining vessels immediately, or we will open fire.
The Kaal Dominion did not conquer worlds, it harvested them. For 9,000 years, the Kaal had ranked every species in the galaxy by a single number, Predation Index. High index meant danger. Low index meant meat. Every world they touched fell into one of those two categories, and no world had ever occupied the space between. The index was not superstition. It was a rigorously maintained scientific model, refined across 400 prior harvests, and validated against every known galactic power the Kaal had ever encountered. A species scoring above 70 warranted diplomatic caution or outright avoidance. A species scoring below 10 was harvested without hesitation, its resources and territory absorbed into Kaal holdings within a single generation. In 9,000 years, the model had never once produced a false result that cost the Dominion a fleet. Earth's file, compiled by a Kaal scouting division called the Nightfang Directorate, carried a predation index of 2 out of 100. Lower than most herd animals, the Kaal harvested for sport on a dozen conquered worlds. Director Scar Vel, commander of the Nightfang scouting fleet, reviewed that file for the 11th time before authorizing first contact. 30 scout ships, 1,200 crew, a single mission. Confirm the index marked the world, prepare it for the main harvesting fleet still 4 years out. Predation Index of 2 is almost insulting, his second-in-command said, a broad-shouldered officer named Threx Kaal who had harvested 6 worlds in his career and never lost a ship doing it. We could send 3 scouts and still finish early. We send 30, Scar said. Not because I expect resistance, because 30 scouts gather 30 times the data, and I intend to hand the main fleet a harvest plan so complete they will not need to fire a single shot in anger. The 30 ships dropped out of subspace at the edge of Earth's solar system, sensors active, weapons cold. Kaal doctrine called for observation before engagement, a rule written into their protocols after 3 separate incidents, centuries apart, where impatient commanders harvested worlds that turned out to have teeth. Those 3 incidents were taught to every Kaal cadet as cautionary case studies, and Scar had memorized each one during his own training decades earlier. A jungle world whose herbivore population turned out to be a dormant hive intelligence. A mining colony whose primitive tools concealed a coordinated resistance movement 4 decades in the making. A quiet ocean world whose predation index of 6 had, in reality, been miscalculated by a scouting error that cost the Dominion an entire harvesting fleet before the mistake was even understood. Scar had built his entire command philosophy around never repeating those errors, and it was that philosophy, more than any single tactical decision, that would ultimately determine how many of his people survived what was coming. Scar did not expect Earth to have teeth. The file was too clean, too documented. Populations spread across a single world with no orbital defense network, no visible fleet, no history of interstellar contact at all. Populations show minimal technological cohesion, his sensor officer reported. No unified planetary defense grid, no detected weapons above conventional kinetic thresholds. This is a pre-contact species, director, textbook low-index profile. Scar allowed himself the smallest measure of satisfaction. A pre-contact species with a predation index this low meant the coming harvest would be efficient, quiet, and profitable, the kind of campaign that built careers rather than ending them. He had built his own career on exactly that kind of campaign, 31 years of scouting reports that had never once required correction after transmission to the main harvesting fleet. The Kaal Dominion did not reward commanders who found trouble where none existed. It rewarded commanders who delivered clean, accurate assessments, and Scar had delivered more of those than any director currently serving the Nightfang Directorate. Threx Kaal, standing beside him on the command deck of the Voidstalker, watched the sensor feeds with the restless energy of an officer who had never learned patience because his career had never once required it. Director, with an index this low, why not accelerate the timeline? Recommend the main fleet advance its harvest date. There is no reason to wait 4 years to collect what is clearly already ours. Because 31 years of scouting has taught me exactly one lesson worth repeating, Scar said. The worlds that look the easiest are the worlds most worth checking twice. I have seen commanders skip that second check. I have delivered their eulogies. Threx said nothing further, though his expression made clear he considered the caution unnecessary, a relic of an older generation's excessive care applied to a species that posed, by every visible measure, no meaningful threat at all. Begin the scouting protocol, Scar ordered. Standard dispersal pattern. I want detailed profiles on every population center by the time the sun sets over their largest ocean. The 30 scout ships spread across near-Earth orbit in a pattern the Kaal had used on 400 prior worlds. A slow, methodical net designed to catalog every detail a harvesting fleet would need. It had never failed to produce an accurate assessment. It had also never been tested against a species that had spent the better part of a century preparing for exactly this moment, quietly, patiently, without ever announcing that preparation to a galaxy that had not yet noticed them. Phase 1 complete. Word of the scouting mission's early data spread through the Nightfang fleet within hours, and with it came a confidence that shaded quickly into contempt. Look at this, Kaal said, pulling up a live feed from a scout positioned above a mid-sized human city. They still burn hydrocarbons for transportation. Their strongest militaries measure power in numbers of soldiers, not numbers of ships. Director, this is not a hunt. This is bookkeeping. Scar reviewed the same feed with more caution than his second-in-command. He had commanded scouting operations for 31 years, long enough to have watched bookkeeping missions turn into 3-year wars that cost the Kaal more ships than the eventual harvest was worth. Bookkeeping missions do not require 30 scout ships, Scar said. Caution is not the same as fear. Continue the survey. I want full profiles on every government structure, every military installation, and every population center with more than 1 million residents. The survey proceeded exactly as doctrine demanded. Kaal sensors mapped human cities with total confidence, cataloging infrastructure the species itself considered obsolete. Conventional airports, surface highways, agricultural regions visible from orbit with no attempt at concealment. What the sensors did not map, because nothing in the Kaal's 400 prior harvests had taught them to look for it, were the facilities built specifically to not exist on any conventional scan. Humanity had spent decades perfecting the art of making advanced infrastructure look exactly like something a low-index species would build. A scout ship designated Nightfang 9 drifted above a region humans called the Rocky Mountains, cataloging what its sensors identified as an abandoned mining complex, decommissioned decades earlier according to public record. Its scan confirmed the facility as dormant, structurally unremarkable, and entirely unworthy of further attention. The scan was correct in every detail the Kaal cared to measure, and wrong about the one detail that mattered. 400 meters beneath that abandoned mining complex, a facility humanity called Anchor Point 7 had been running continuous operations for 38 years, monitoring exactly this kind of scouting activity, waiting for exactly this kind of fleet. Aboard Nightfang 9, a junior sensor technician named Vras Dahl noticed something that did not fit the pattern. A fractional energy signature beneath the mining complex too faint to register as anomalous under standard thresholds, but present nonetheless in the raw data. Sir, Vras said to his commanding officer, I have a residual reading beneath grid 742. Could be geothermal, could be equipment malfunction on our end. His commanding officer, A veteran named Grask Ilvo, who had scouted 11 worlds without a single reported anomaly turning into anything meaningful, glanced at the reading and dismissed it in under 3 seconds. Geothermal, Grask said. This entire mountain range is volcanic in origin. Log it and move on. We have 400 more grid squares to survey before the shift ends. Vrass logged it exactly as instructed, and the reading disappeared into a data archive that would not be reviewed again until it was far too late to matter. It was the first piece of evidence the Kaal ever gathered that Earth was not what its file claimed. It would not be the last, and every subsequent piece would be dismissed with the same casual confidence. 400 meters beneath that same mountain, Colonel Rosalind Achterberg watched Nightfang 9's scan pattern pass overhead on a display built specifically to detect exactly this kind of surface survey. She had commanded Anchor Point 7 for 14 years, longer than any officer in its history, and had spent every one of those years running drills for a scenario she genuinely believed she might never live to see executed. They flagged our thermal bleed and dismissed it, her intelligence chief reported, reviewing the intercepted Kaal sensor logs their own systems had quietly copied in passing. Logged as geothermal, no follow-up scheduled. Good, Achterberg said. Let them keep believing that. The moment they stop dismissing anomalies is the moment this stops working exactly as designed. She turned to the room's largest display, where 30 scout ship signatures moved across a live orbital map with the unhurried confidence of a species that had never once needed to survey a world twice. Full dispersal pattern confirmed. Begin passive data collection on every scout vessel. I want their shield frequencies, their sensor blind spots, and their communication protocols cataloged before they finish cataloging us. Her intelligence chief hesitated before responding. Colonel, if we're wrong about their intentions, if this really is just a survey and not a prelude to invasion, then we've spent 38 years and an enormous amount of the planet's resources preparing for nothing, Achterberg said. I have made my peace with that possibility every single year I've held this command, but their own data file rated us at a predation index of 2, major. Species that survey worlds they intend to leave alone do not bother rating them for harvest at all. Anchor Point 7 had not been built in response to any single threat. It had been built, decades earlier, in response to a discovery that unsettled the small circle of scientists and military planners who first made it. A derelict probe, non-human in origin, found adrift at the edge of the solar system, its logs partially recoverable despite centuries of damage. The probe carried no weapons and no hostile intent of its own. It carried something more unsettling, a cataloging routine that measured biological populations purely in terms of harvest yield. The scientists who decoded that routine spent a year arguing about whether to tell the public at all. In the end, a small, quietly assembled coalition of governments chose secrecy over panic, reasoning that a species capable of building probes like that one would return eventually, and that the only meaningful response was decades of patient, invisible preparation, rather than any attempt to warn a public that could not meaningfully change the outcome by knowing. We built this facility for a scouting fleet that might never come, Achterberg had told her own senior staff on her first day in command, 14 years earlier. If it never comes, we will have spent our careers on something no one outside this facility will ever know mattered. If it does come, we will have exactly one chance to get the response right, because a species that measures worlds by harvest yield does not send warnings before it sends fleets. That single day, she understood now, watching 30 scout ships settle into orbit above a world they believed defenseless, had finally arrived. Phase 2 complete. The landing teams touched down at 4 separate sites across the planet, small squads equipped for reconnaissance rather than combat, exactly as doctrine specified for a world with a predation index this low. Scarvel had authorized the deployment that morning, confident the surface sampling would confirm everything the orbital survey already suggested. A 12-member team, led by an officer named Dresk Vonner, set down in a forested region of North America, expecting to spend the day gathering biological samples and observing local wildlife patterns before returning to their ship by nightfall. They did not expect to be observed in turn, from concealed positions less than 200 meters away, by a human reconnaissance unit that had been tracking their descent from the moment their shuttle entered the atmosphere. "Contact confirmed," a human soldier whispered into a secure channel, watching the Kaal team spread out through the tree line with the casual confidence of hunters who had never once considered themselves prey. 12 hostiles, light equipment, no visible heavy weapons. They think this is an empty forest. "Hold position," came the reply from a command post buried deep beneath a mountain range the Kaal had already dismissed as geothermal noise. "Observe only. We want their full sampling pattern before we decide anything." Dresk Vonner's team spent 4 hours moving through the forest, cataloging plant life, testing soil composition, and recording wildlife with an efficiency that would have impressed any Kaal command review board. Not once did their instruments register the 23 human observers tracking their every movement from carefully concealed positions. "This species has no detectable counter-surveillance capability," Dresk reported back to his ship. "We have moved through populated wilderness for 4 hours without triggering a single security response. Recommend downgrading our threat caution for future ground operations." Aboard Nightfang 9, Grask Ilvo received the report with satisfaction, forwarding it up the chain to Skar Vel as further confirmation of the Predation Index. Every data point continued to support the same conclusion. Humanity was exactly as weak as the original file suggested, perhaps weaker. What none of the landing teams knew, because nothing in their scans had detected it, was that every single sample they gathered, every soil reading, every biological specimen, every recorded conversation between their own team members, had been recorded by systems humanity had spent decades designing specifically to remain invisible to exactly this kind of technology. A second landing team, operating near a coastal settlement in East Asia, encountered something closer to genuine surprise. Their scans detected a research vessel offshore, flagged in public maritime records as an oceanographic survey ship studying deep current patterns. "Standard civilian research vessel," the team's sensor officer reported. "No military signature, no armament detected. Recommend we ignore it and continue our coastal sampling." The research vessel was, in fact, exactly what its records claimed: an oceanographic survey ship, studying deep current patterns, operated by civilian scientists with no military affiliation whatsoever. It was also, simultaneously, transmitting every detail of the Kaal landing team's equipment, movement patterns, and biological signatures to the same buried command post that had been tracking Dresk Vonner's team since morning. Humanity had not built its defense around hiding weapons. It had built its defense around hiding the fact that everything, weapons and civilians alike, was already part of the same watching system, layered so deeply into the ordinary texture of the world that a scouting force could walk through it for hours without ever suspecting it existed. A third landing team, smaller and more curious than the others, set down near a farming community in the American Midwest, drawn by orbital scans indicating a dense concentration of agricultural infrastructure. Its 2-member crew, expecting nothing more eventful than soil sampling, instead found themselves observed at close range by a farmer named Wesley Ackhaffer, who had spent his entire adult life aware that the quiet county he called home sat directly above one of Anchor Point 7's forward sensor nodes. Wesley did not call the authorities. He did not need to. His farmhouse had been fitted years earlier with equipment indistinguishable from ordinary agricultural monitoring hardware, and he had been briefed exactly once, a decade prior, on what to do if he ever saw exactly what he was seeing now. Nothing. Just keep doing what you're doing, the briefing had told him. Don't approach. Don't react. Let the system see what it needs to see. You are not the defense, Mr. Akafor. You are simply someone living an ordinary life on top of one. He kept feeding his cattle while two Kaal scouts collected soil samples less than 400 meters away, his heart pounding beneath a calm exterior that would have made Colonel Achterberg proud, had she been watching him directly instead of watching the sensor feed his farm quietly generated. His daughter, 7 years old, asked him at dinner that evening why he had seemed distracted all afternoon. Wesley told her he was simply tired from the day's work, a small, necessary lie that thousands of families across the planet were telling their own children that same week, each one a tiny act of discipline in service of a plan most of them would never fully understand. By the time the landing teams returned to their ships that evening, Scarvel had compiled a preliminary harvest report he considered ready for transmission to the main fleet. He did not know that every word of it had already been intercepted, analyzed, and cross-referenced against 38 years of accumulated data on species exactly like the Kaal. Phase 3 complete. The first sign that something had gone wrong reached Scarvel 3 days into the survey, in the form of a report so small it almost escaped his attention entirely. Nightfang 14, positioned above a human region called the Pacific Northwest, reported a brief, unexplained loss of sensor contact with a two-person reconnaissance team on the surface. The loss lasted exactly 90 seconds before contact resumed, with both team members reporting nothing unusual during the gap. Equipment malfunction, the ship's engineering officer concluded, after a routine diagnostic found no fault in the sensor array. Possibly atmospheric interference. The team confirms no incident during the disruption. Scar logged the report and moved on, exactly as Grask Ilvo had moved on from the residual energy reading 3 days earlier. 90 seconds of sensor loss, against 30 ships and 1,200 crew members conducting a survey that had otherwise proceeded without incident, did not rise to the level of concern. It should have. In those 90 seconds, a joint human intelligence team had boarded the reconnaissance team's shuttle undetected, extracted a complete technical schematic of its propulsion and shielding systems, and departed without leaving a single trace their own instruments could detect. The two-person Kaal team never knew they had been boarded. Neither did anyone reviewing the sensor logs afterward. The schematic reached Anchor Point 7 within the hour, where a team of engineers who had spent their entire careers preparing for exactly this kind of intelligence windfall began the work of translating Kaal technology into a set of exploitable weaknesses. Their shielding is rated for kinetic and directed energy threats consistent with what we'd expect from a species that fights other species like themselves. The lead engineer reported to Colonel Rosalind Achterberg, commander of Anchor Point 7, and the officer who had waited 14 years for a scouting fleet to finally justify the facility's existence. It is not rated for anything we've spent the last 4 decades building specifically, because nothing like us has ever attacked them before. Then we use exactly that, Achterberg said. Begin final validation on the deep strike platforms. If this fleet reports back with a low Predation Index, the main harvesting fleet arrives in 4 years believing Earth is exactly as weak as their scouts claim. We do not get a second chance to correct that impression before real damage happens. In a hardened silo 300 kilometers from Anchor Point 7, a young pilot named Imani Osai, no relation to any officer in any prior campaign, but raised on the same doctrine of patient preparation, ran final systems checks on an interceptor that had never once flown a live engagement. She had trained for this exact scenario since flight school, in simulations built entirely from the very Kaal engagement data Anchor Point 7 had spent decades quietly compiling. Nervous? Her crew chief asked, watching her hands move through the pre-flight checklist with practiced precision. "No," Imani said, and meant it. "I've flown this exact engagement 1,100 times in simulation. Today it just happens to be real instead of theoretical. The nerves already happened years ago, the first time I ran the scenario and lost." Echterberg reviewed the deployment plan a final time with her senior staff, a plan that had been revised, refined, and quietly rehearsed for nearly 4 decades without ever once being executed against a genuine target. "Deep strike platforms confirmed at full readiness," her weapons officer reported. "Interceptor squadrons on standby. Colonel, once we engage, there is no version of this plan that ends with a quiet withdrawal on their side. We commit to disabling their fleet, or we let them leave with a false assessment that brings the real harvesting fleet in 4 years instead." "We commit," Echterberg said. "We did not build this facility to let a false report reach their command structure unchallenged. Every year we spent on this program was spent on exactly this decision. Prepare to engage the moment they show us they intend real harm rather than mere observation." Aboard the Nightfang fleet, the survey continued for 2 more days without further incident, each report reinforcing Scarvel's growing confidence that the harvest assessment would close exactly as the original file predicted. He began drafting his final transmission to the main fleet commander, a message that would set in motion 4 years of preparation for a full-scale harvesting campaign against a world he genuinely believed could not meaningfully resist it. He was 3 paragraphs into that draft when Nightfang 22, positioned above a human region near the equator, lost contact entirely. Not a 90-second gap, not an unexplained interference pattern. Complete, total silence, the kind that in Kaal doctrine meant only one thing: the ship was gone. "Recall all landing teams," Scar ordered, abandoning his draft mid-sentence, his earlier confidence replaced by the specific, focused alertness of a commander who had survived 31 years by never dismissing silence as coincidence. "Full fleet alert. I want to know what happened to Nightfang 22 before another minute passes." Phase 4 complete. What happened to Nightfang 22 became clear within minutes, and it changed everything Scarvel believed about the world beneath him. A single strike, launched from a platform that had shown no detectable signature until the exact moment it fired, had struck the scout ship's primary reactor with a precision that suggested its exact structural weak point had been known in advance, rather than discovered through trial and error. The ship had not merely been damaged. It had been dismantled, in under 4 seconds, by a weapon the Kaal had no prior record of encountering anywhere in the galaxy. "Impossible," Threx Kaal said, staring at the sensor data. "That strike required knowledge of our reactor architecture that no species outside the Kaal Dominion should possess." "They boarded Nightfang 14 3 days ago," Scar said, the pieces assembling themselves in his mind with sickening speed. "The 90-second sensor gap, it was not equipment malfunction. It was reconnaissance, conducted against us, undetected, by a species we rated as incapable of detecting our own reconnaissance teams walking through their forests." The realization arrived too late to prevent what came next. Across the planet, in coordinated strikes separated by mere seconds, similar weapons platforms engaged 11 more scout ships simultaneously, each strike calibrated to the exact structural vulnerabilities of Kaal vessel design, each one landing before targeting solutions could even be attempted in return. "This is not a defense response," Scar said, watching the fleet's status board shed ships faster than he could process the losses. "A defense response reacts to a threat. This is an ambush. They have been planning this exact sequence since before we entered the system." Aboard Nightfang 9, Grask Ilvo watched his own ship's sensors flood with contact warnings from platforms that had not existed on any prior scan. Emerging from concealment across the very mountain range, his junior technician had flagged as an anomaly 3 days earlier. The dismissed geothermal reading had been, in fact, exactly what Vras Dahl suspected: a facility running warm beneath a mountain that had nothing to do with volcanic activity at all. Grask said, his voice tight, "The reading you flagged. Pull the full historical data, now." Vrask complied, and the screen filled with a signature that had been present, faint but consistent, for the entire duration of their survey, growing marginally stronger with each passing hour, as Anchor Point 7 systems came fully online in response to the scouting fleet's presence. "It was never geothermal," Vrask said quietly. "It was them, waking up, the entire time we were flying over it, congratulating ourselves on how quiet this world was." Imani Osai's squadron launched from its hardened silo the moment Anchor Point 7's deep strike platforms opened fire, tasked with engaging any Kaal vessel that attempted to break formation and flee before the full strike sequence completed. Her interceptor cleared atmosphere in under 90 seconds, a climb rate her simulations had rehearsed 1,000 times, but her body had never once actually felt. "Contact bearing 317, her weapons officer called out. "Nightfang 6, attempting evasive breakaway toward the Western Hemisphere." "I have it," Imani said, adjusting her intercept vector with a calm that surprised even her. The Kaal scout ship, already damaged from a near-miss strike moments earlier, banked hard in an attempt to shake pursuit, executing a maneuver her simulations had specifically modeled and specifically defeated 1,100 times. She matched the maneuver a half-second before it completed, closing to effective range and firing a single coordinated strike that disabled the ship's propulsion without breaching its hull, exactly as Anchor Point 7's rules of engagement demanded. Disable, do not annihilate, wherever the choice was available. "Target neutralized, non-lethal," she reported, requesting confirmation on additional breakaway attempts. "None currently detected," her crew chief answered. "Nice flying, Osai. 1,100 simulations and you still made it look easier than the manual." Aboard the fleeing remnants of the Nightfang fleet, Scarvel watched his tactical display shed one more ship, then another, each loss delivered with the same restrained precision that had characterized every strike since the ambush began. It was not the violence of the engagement that unsettled him most. It was the discipline behind it, a species capable of overwhelming force choosing, again and again, to disable rather than destroy. The strikes continued for 6 more minutes, methodical and unhurried, each Kaal ship engaged only after its precise location and vulnerability profile had been confirmed beyond doubt. By the time Scarvel gave the order to withdraw, 17 of his 30 scout ships had gone dark, destroyed or disabled by weapons that had no entry in any Kaal threat registry. "All remaining ships, full retreat to rally point," Scar ordered, his voice carrying none of the confidence it had held 3 days earlier. "Do not engage further. Do not attempt further sampling. I want every surviving vessel back in formation and ready to break for subspace within 10 minutes. Phase 5 complete." The retreat did not go cleanly. Nothing about Earth, Scarvel now understood, was going to go cleanly ever again. As the 13 surviving scout ships attempted to regroup at their designated rally point, a formation of vessels neither their sensors nor their intelligence had ever recorded rose from low orbit to intercept them, moving with a coordination that suggested decades of joint tactical development rather than a hastily assembled response to an unexpected incursion. "Identify those contacts," Scar demanded, though he already suspected the answer would tell him. Nothing his instruments had not already failed to warn him about. "Unknown design, Director," his sensor officer reported, voice strained. "Estimated combat capability exceeds our own by a significant margin. They were not on any prior scan. They were not on any historical record. They simply were not there, and now they are everywhere." Colonel Ichterberg's voice cut across an open channel moments later, translated through a system Anchor Point 7 had spent years perfecting specifically for this contingency, calm in a way that unsettled Scar more than aggression would have. Nightfang Fleet, this is Anchor Point 7 Command, she said. You came to assess a Predation Index. We are updating your file. You may return home with the correction, or you may continue this engagement and return home as wreckage. The choice and the accuracy of your final report belongs entirely to you. Threx Kaal, still processing the loss of 17 ships in under 10 minutes, urged immediate counterattack, unable to accept a retreat that would mark the first defeat of his entire career. Scar silenced him with a single look that carried 31 years of hard-earned judgment behind it. We came to gather data, Scar said. We have gathered data. It is not the data we expected, but it is the most important assessment this fleet has ever produced, and it will not reach the main harvesting fleet if we die here, proving a point Threx's pride demands we prove. He opened a channel back to Ichterberg, his voice stripped of the contempt it had carried 3 days earlier. This is Director Scar Vel of the Nightfang Directorate. We withdraw. Confirm safe passage for surviving vessels to the system boundary. Confirmed, Ichterberg said. We do not need to destroy every ship in your fleet to make our point, Director. We only need one of you to survive long enough to deliver it accurately. Before the retreating fleet crossed into subspace range, a single Kaal escape pod, ejected from one of the disabled scout ships during the initial ambush, drifted within recovery range of a human vessel patrolling the debris field. Aboard it was Dresk Vonner, the officer who had led the forest reconnaissance team days earlier, convinced Earth's wilderness held no meaningful counter-surveillance capability. The human crew that recovered his pod treated him with the same measured, deliberate restraint that had defined the entire engagement. No interrogation under duress, no display of triumph, only a quiet debrief conducted by an officer who introduced herself simply as Lieutenant Vasquez, part of the same reconnaissance unit that had tracked his team through the tree line without his ever knowing it. You walked past 23 of my soldiers in that forest, Vasquez told him, not as a boast but as a statement of fact she seemed to consider important for him to carry home. None of them fired. None of them needed to. We wanted you to finish your survey exactly as planned, so your fleet would report exactly what we wanted reported, until the moment we decided otherwise. Dresk absorbed the information in silence, the scale of what he had failed to detect settling over him slowly. Why tell me this now? Why not simply hold me as a prisoner and say nothing? Because a prisoner who understands what actually happened is more valuable to us than a prisoner who spends his captivity assuming he was simply unlucky, Vasquez said. We are returning you to your fleet before it enters subspace. Tell your director exactly what I told you. Accuracy matters more to us than victory. Dresk's pod was released back toward the retreating Kaal formation under a clear signal of parley, an act of calculated restraint that would follow him through the rest of his career as vividly as the ambush itself. A single data point that no amount of later analysis ever fully explained to his own satisfaction. The 13 surviving scout ships broke formation and ran for the system's edge, pursued not by weapons fire, but by a silent escort of human vessels that shadowed their retreat without ever closing to engagement range. A final, deliberate demonstration that restraint, not weakness, had shaped every decision of the preceding hour. 4 ships did not survive the retreat, picked off by defense platforms positioned along predictable escape vectors that Kaal Doctrine had used, unchanged, for centuries. 9 ships crossed the system boundary and entered subspace, carrying survivors who understood, for the first time in their careers, what it felt like to be the hunted rather than the hunter. Phase 6 complete. Of the 9 ships that entered subspace, only 1 emerged intact on the other side. A cascading failure in the subspace corridor, triggered by damage, none of the surviving ships had fully diagnosed before the jump, claimed 8 vessels in transit, their crews lost in a manner too catastrophic and too poorly understood to ever fully investigate. Only Scar Vel's own ship, the flagship Voidstalker, limped out of subspace at the edge of Kaal territory, carrying the sole surviving account of what had happened above Earth. Scar stood before the Kaal Dominion's High Assessment Council 11 days later, the only witness capable of testifying to an engagement that had cost the Nightfang Directorate 29 ships and over 1,000 crew members in less than a single day. "You are telling this council," said Councillor Marash D. Hun, presiding officer of the assessment board, "that a species with a documented predation index of 2 destroyed 29 Kaal scout vessels, using weapons technology that appears nowhere in any prior threat registry. Explain how such an assessment error was possible." "Because the index was accurate to what we allowed ourselves to measure," Scar said, "and nothing to what they allowed us to see. We surveyed a species that spent decades, possibly longer, deliberately presenting itself as harmless to any scouting force that might arrive. We did not fail to detect their strength because it was hidden by chance. We failed because it was hidden by design, executed with a patience no prior harvest target has ever demonstrated." A long silence settled over the council chamber. Marash D. Hun finally spoke again, his voice carrying the particular caution of a species that had never once needed to reconsider its fundamental approach to conquest. A younger councillor, Vesa Orn, who had opposed Scar's promotion to director 3 years earlier and had little patience for what she initially assumed was an attempt to excuse a catastrophic failure, pressed the challenge further. "Or, Director, you simply commanded poorly and now seek to elevate your own incompetence into the story of an unstoppable enemy. The Dominion has harvested 400 worlds. None of them required this degree of caution. None of them spent decades studying us specifically," Scar said, meeting her challenge without flinching, 31 years of command experience carrying more weight in that moment than any defensive posture could have. "Counselor, I invite you to review the sensor logs yourself. Every strike that disabled a Kaal vessel targeted its exact structural weak point on the first attempt. That is not the signature of an improvised defense. That is the signature of an enemy who has held our own engineering schematics for longer than we have any evidence of contact between our species." Vesa Orn had no immediate answer for that, and the silence that followed carried more weight in the chamber than any rebuttal could have. "Your recommendation, Director." "Do not send the main harvesting fleet," Scar said. "Not in 4 years. Not in 40. Every piece of intelligence we gathered on that world was intelligence they permitted us to gather. We do not know what we do not know about them, and a species capable of hiding an entire defensive infrastructure beneath a predation index of 2 is not a species I am willing to recommend engaging again without a complete revision of everything we believe about how threat assessment works." The council did not reach a decision that day. It would take months of closed deliberation, and the quiet, permanent reassignment of the entire Nightfang Directorate to observation-only status before the Kaal Dominion formally struck Earth from its active harvesting registry, marking it instead with a designation that had never before appeared in Kaal records. "Unknown. Do not approach." Word of the revised designation traveled slowly through Kalaline space, filtered carefully through diplomatic and military channels that had no established protocol for admitting a scouting failure of this scale. Rival empires along the Dominion's border, long accustomed to treating Kaal threat assessments as the most reliable in known space, took quiet note of the anomaly, some independently reopening their own dormant files on the small, unremarkable world its scouts had once rated a 2. Phase 7 complete. On Earth, Colonel Rosalind Ichterberg watched the last confirmed Kaal signature fade from Anchor Point 7's long-range sensors, the silence afterward carrying the particular weight of a threat that had not been destroyed, only postponed. "Will they come back, Colonel?" asked a young officer beside her, watching the same empty sky. "Eventually," Ichterberg said. "Every predator eventually returns to test ground it once thought was safe. When they do, they will not find a predation index of 2 waiting for them. They will find exactly what one scout ship limped home to describe, and they still will not believe it until they see it again themselves. On the farm where Wesley Ackefer had spent an afternoon feeding cattle within 400 meters of two Kaal scouts, life resumed with the same unremarkable rhythm it had held for generations. He never told his daughter what had actually happened that day, not because the truth was forbidden exactly, but Beck. Oz Anchor Point 7's doctrine held that the fewer people who understood the full shape of the plan, the longer that plan would remain effective the next time it was needed. Years later, when his daughter was old enough to be briefed into the same quiet network of watchers her father had belonged to, Wesley finally told her the story in full, ending it the same way the briefing officer had ended it for him decades earlier. "You are not the defense," he told her. "You are simply someone living an ordinary life on top of one. That is enough. That has always been enough." Imani Os flew 4 more patrol rotations before Anchor Point 7 stood down from full alert status, each one uneventful in the specific, deliberate way that meant the deterrence was working exactly as designed. She kept, framed in her quarters, a single line from her final debrief, words spoken by Colonel Achterberg to the assembled interceptor squadrons the evening the last call signature left the system. "You did not win today by being seen," Achterberg had told them. "You won by being exactly as invisible as we needed you to be, for exactly as long as we needed it, and then by being undeniable the moment invisibility stopped serving the plan." Dresk Vonner returned to Kaal territory aboard the Voidstalker, spent the remainder of his career unable to fully explain, even to himself, why Lieutenant Vasquez had chosen honesty over silence in that debrief. He requested reassignment to the newly designated Observation-Only Division of the Night Fang Directorate, the only Kaal officer to volunteer for a post most of his peers considered a demotion in all but name. "Why remain assigned to a world you were nearly killed studying?" a colleague asked him once, genuinely curious. "Because I walked through their forest for 4 hours and never once knew I was being watched," Dresk said. "I would like to understand, eventually, what kind of patience makes that possible. I suspect it will take longer than my remaining career to find out." Far beneath the mountain that the Kaal had once dismissed as nothing more than geothermal noise, Anchor Point 7 systems settled back into their quiet, patient rhythm, watching, cataloging, waiting, exactly as they had for 38 years before this single afternoon finally justified their existence. The Predator world had marked Earth as easy prey. Only one scout ship came back to explain why that had been the last mistake it would ever make. Apex Chronicle will return.